Hello everyone. Today's video will be a bit different than usual. It will feature a dialogue to help you learn about a cosmological argument for God's existence. This dialogue will show how cosmological arguments can answer skeptical objections and lead to a strong case for God. I hope you will find this video interesting and educational. And now, on to the dialogue. I don't think there are any good reasons to believe in God's existence. That's a strong claim. What makes you say that? Well, I've seen arguments for God, but they either seem way too technical or convoluted for any average person to follow, or they are overly simplistic and built on dubious premises. Your concerns are fair. Many arguments made by philosophers can seem dauntingly complex, and can feel like a word salad, because of how much effort it takes to understand them. And likewise, laymen often overstate the case for God, using weak or poorly defended arguments. But there are some philosophers who are able to communicate difficult concepts or arguments in simpler terms, leaving you with something to think about. Would it be alright if I shared an example of that with you? Sure, I guess. Let's see it. Okay, this is based on an argument presented by Dr. Alexander Pruss, a Catholic philosopher. He does really well combining rigor with layman-friendly language. The argument is a cosmological argument for God, and it starts with a very simple observation. Causation exists. Well, yeah, that makes sense. My vocal cords cause my speech right now. My parents caused me. Their parents caused them. I'll grant it, but I don't think that does much to prove God. You're right, but we're just getting started here. The question we have to ask is this. What best explains the presupposition that causation exists? And so let's take a look at our options. Let's do it. So one possibility we could put out there to explain causation is something called circular causation. What's that? It's the idea that something causes something else that ultimately leads to its own causation. Or like this, A causes B causes C causes A. It creates a circle. Some people actually say this is how the universe came into being. They will say the universe created itself. Well, intuitively, that doesn't seem possible. How could something cause itself? I agree. We can imagine the example of a chicken going back in time to lay an egg that would later hatch into itself. It doesn't really make sense. Or the famous grandfather paradox. If you went back in time to kill your grandpa before he had children, he couldn't have led to you. But you were the one who killed him in the first place. It seems like circular causation is paradoxical. How could something truly cause itself, unless it was somehow also before itself? Right. Well, it seems to me like circular causation can't explain causation very well. But that's certainly not the only path we could go down. You're right. Another, more popular approach is to argue that the universe had an eternal, infinite past of causality. One thing, caused by something before that, caused by something before that, going back ad infinitum, and never terminating. Yeah, that seems more reasonable. David Hume pointed out that every single event in an infinite set of events would then be explained by that which is immediately prior. We can understand the universe pretty well with that viewpoint. Everything within the set is left explained. Well, I will admit it is somewhat more intuitive than positing a circle of causality, but I still see problems here. Like what? Well, I think there is something paradoxical about positing the existence of infinity. But hold on, infinity is a concept we use in math a lot, such as in calculus. You are right. The difference, though, is that these are theoretical, abstract infinities, or a limit that is being approached but never reached, as opposed to an actual infinity existing in time and space. That's where contradictions seem to arise. What sorts of contradictions? Well, there have been a lot of thought experiments used to suggest this to be the case, such as Hilbert's Hotel, the Grim Reaper paradox, Smulyan's rod, and others. But I'll share just one with you that I like, an infinite card game. How does that work? Imagine a deck with an actually infinite number of cards. Imagine that on each card is a positive integer, from 1, 2, 3, ad infinitum. There is a card with each and every positive integer on it. And we're going to play a game with the deck. But first, we have to have the cards shuffled. How would you shuffle an infinite deck? Well, in this thought experiment, we are positing an actual infinity exists, or can exist. So we could simply say that for every n days ago, we shuffled the top n cards in the deck. 10 days ago, the top 10 cards were shuffled. 10,000 days ago, the top 10,000 cards were shuffled. So that would mean all the cards in the infinite set get shuffled. Okay, that works, I guess, at least for the purposes of the thought experiment. So what's the game? For the game, you and I each pick a card from the deck. Whoever's card has the higher number on it will win $100. Seems simple enough. But now imagine picking your card and taking a look at what number you have before we show each other our cards. You're going to see it and instantly be certain that you've lost the game. I can guarantee it. How can you say that? Well, let's just imagine your card is 10 trillion and 7. How many cards are going to have lower numbers in the entire deck? Well, 10 trillion and 6. One card for each whole number between 1 and my card's value. You're right. And how many cards are going to have higher numbers than yours in the deck? I suppose it would have to be an infinite amount of cards, right? Correct. No matter what number is on your card, even a Google, there will always be a finite number of cards with lower values and an infinite number of cards with higher values. But wait, that would also be true of your card, wouldn't it? Precisely. We would both be in the same boat, and so both of us would take a look at our finitely numbered card and would be more than 99.99% certain that the other person had a higher number on their card. But that doesn't make sense. Two cards in a well-shuffled deck would obviously have a 50-50 chance of being higher or lower than the other. And that's where the contradiction appears to come in. An actual infinite seems to break the laws of logic in this case. On one hand, the odds to win should be 50-50, but from our individual perspectives and the cards we each have, it looks like winning is all but impossible. Wow, yeah, I see how the logic seems to bend when we use an actual infinity. And this is just one example. As I said, there are many others. Because of these absurdities that seem to arise when we talk about actual infinity, I think it is very reasonable to adopt the view that an actual infinity cannot exist in time and space. Or we could even take a more modest position and simply affirm something known as causal finitism, the idea that there cannot be an infinite number of causes leading to an effect, lest we get absurdities, such as what we see in the card game. I see. Well, I admit that your argument makes sense to me. But regardless, I think a reasonable person could still argue that these paradoxes aren't an automatic defeater of the idea of an infinite regress. Well, you have a fair point there. I mean, I'm personally convinced by the paradoxes, but it might not be a slam dunk for everyone, at least when they first hear them. In fact, you may be surprised to know that St. Thomas Aquinas himself was not convinced that one could prove the finitude of the universe from philosophy or science. Wait, really? Even though the Bible and church tradition say the universe had a beginning? Yep. While St. Thomas thought we could take it on faith, he rejected attempts at arguing for a finite past, saying it couldn't be proven by pure reason. Wow. From what I've heard, medieval Christians were superstitious, illogical, and would go along with anything that they thought could help them prove their beliefs. I would have never thought that they would show this sort of healthy skepticism regarding attempts to prove Christian doctrines. Indeed, the ideas you're describing about medieval Christians are a very prevalent myth, pushed by some who want to argue that the secular Enlightenment brought us out of the Christian Dark Ages. But actual historians don't talk in this way. But it remains a popular idea among the public, thanks in part to the new atheists. That is certainly something to think about. But back to the argument, I'm somewhat confused. If we entertain Thomas's skepticism about disproving an infinite regress, we destroy causal finitism, and the argument stalls. Well, interestingly, the argument for a first cause stands, even without causal finitism. But how could there be a first cause if we have an infinite regress of causes? Well, you see, a first cause is still on the table, even if what it causes is past eternal, or goes infinitely back in the past. Here's an illustration. Imagine a hand that has been pressed into a pile of sand from eternity past, always staying pressed in the sand. The hand print that is made in the sand is being caused by the hand, even though the hand and the print are both past eternal. Or another example, consider water that has been frozen from eternity past. The low temperature is still the eternal cause of the water's frozen state, even if the water has always been frozen. You can't have the frozen water without the low temperature causing it to stay frozen. So causation and its effect don't necessarily need to be able to be mapped on a timeline, with the cause temporally preceding the effect. Therefore, a first cause could still exist in an eternal universe as an explanation for the entire eternal set of causes. That makes sense. But still, with an infinite regress, why should we think there needs to be some outside explanation for it at all? Well, to put it plainly, an infinite regress doesn't actually help us understand causation at all. I think a good way to illustrate this is to look at one of the big questions that many ancient peoples were asking and trying to answer. What question is that? It was this: why does the earth stay where it is, from our perspective, and not fall down? Put yourself in the mind of an ancient person who doesn't know about the concept of gravity. It seems that light things, such as smoke or steam, are what go up, while heavy things, like rocks, are what fall down. But the earth itself is not made up of light things. It is made up of heavy, earthy substances. So how does it stay up and not fall? Interesting. I can see how that would be confusing to them. What explanations did they come up with at the time? Well, one popular option was to argue that the earth was resting on top of something else. The ancient Greek philosopher Thales said it was lying on a vast ocean. The Greek poet Pindar said the earth rested on pillars. The Hindus taught that it was resting on the backs of 4 elephants. What do you think about those types of explanations? Well, they are certainly interesting images to imagine, but they don't exactly work as sound theories. What makes you say that? Well, they don't seem to answer the question. They just cry out for more explanations. For example, what is underneath the elephants or the pillars to hold them up? Positing additional heavy things, like planet-sized elephants or pillars, as the reason why the heavy earth doesn't fall down, doesn't really make the problem go away. It actually makes it harder to solve. That's exactly right. But now let's bring infinity into the equation. Consider the popular illustration of the earth sitting on the back of a giant turtle. And what's that turtle being held up by? Another turtle. That turtle, another turtle. Ad infinitum. Turtles all the way down, one standing on top of the shell of another. You'll notice that this actually doesn't explain why the earth doesn't fall any better than a finite number of turtles. In fact, it makes it more difficult to understand why the extremely heavy infinite set of turtles plus the earth wouldn't fall down. You can see how even if we allow for an actually infinite chain, it doesn't actually get us any closer to an ultimate explanation for causation. In short, an infinite regress is not the type of explanation we can use to ground reality or causation. Yes, I think I see your point. Or consider another example. Imagine a really long train moving along some tracks, and imagine if you happened to look at a particular boxcar as it went along and ask the question, what's causing that boxcar to move? Well, you could say, the boxcar in front of it, but then you'd have to answer what's causing that boxcar to move. Of course, someone could say, there's an infinite number of boxcars, with each being pulled by the next. But even if that infinite set were possible, it wouldn't actually help us understand the motion of the boxcars, because we could just as easily imagine an infinite chain of boxcars standing still. The fact that they are moving, one after another, cries out for an ultimate, terminating explanation for the entire chain. In the case of the boxcars, it's the locomotive, pulling all of them along. In a similar way, it seems that causes and their effects in time are best explained by a grounding, ultimate explanation that explains all causes and is itself uncaused, namely, the uncaused cause. So you are positing an uncaused cause as the grounding of every causation. I guess I see how that might be better than a circle of causation or an infinite regress, but I feel like we could still settle for simpler explanations. What sort of simpler explanations? Well, what if we say that in certain situations, things happen without an actual cause we can point to? For example, we could say the universe came into existence without an explanation. Yes, well, that's actually a common response given by skeptics, but it comes at a pretty big cost. What cost? Well, there's a principle called the principle of sufficient reason. The principle works by dividing up all things that exist into two categories: necessary and contingent. Necessary things must be true by definition in all possible worlds, such as a triangle having three sides, or 1 plus 1 equaling 2. These are just brute facts, and they don't have a further explanation, as far as we know. But outside of definitions and some theoretical concepts, we also have contingent things. These could have been otherwise if circumstances had played out a different way. For example, I could have been taller, or had less hair, or I could have simply never existed. Basically, we deal with contingent things in reality. They are not true by necessity, and could have been otherwise. And for these sorts of things, things that could have been otherwise, they always have an explanation for their existence. Well, why is it so important that we follow this principle? Well, you see, it's a rule that is actually foundational to the idea of science. Scientists rely on the idea of inference to the best explanation. So they use the PSR as a means to explain data with a scientific theory, such as gravity or evolution, which can't necessarily be observed, but they are still able to be established as true through scientists developing a best explanation of the data that they do see. You start to undermine processes like these when you posit that contingent things could just simply pop into existence without an explanation. I think I see what you mean. You're saying that without the presupposition that contingent things have explanations for their existence, we have philosophical problems for science, because someone could always argue that something simply happened without an explanation, instead of developing an actual theory. Precisely. Consider how in every circumstance, the simpler theory is just to say there's no explanation at all, rather than deriving a theory from data. Newton could have just said, the apple fell from the tree without an explanation. Or consider someone who embraces solipsism, because it's easier for them to say their own mind exists without explanation than it is for them to say the entire 14 billion year old, 93 billion light year wide universe exists without explanation. There's always a simpler story when we allow for things to happen without explanation, and it seems to undermine reality. There's a lot more that could be said on the subject, and I would recommend looking into Dr. Pruss's work for very thorough defenses of the PSR, but long story short, it seems like we should accept it and realize that all contingent things have an ultimate explanation for their existence. This is what we call the first cause. Yeah, I will definitely have to look further into the PSR, but I think it makes sense to accept it. So to this point, you've shown that causation needs an explanation, and it cannot be ultimately explained by circularity or infinite regress. This indeed seems to leave us with a first cause. But we don't have to automatically say, therefore God, even if we accept the first cause. How can we even know anything about a first cause? Well, you are right that getting to a first cause doesn't mean the argument succeeds in showing God exists. This is why we have to take a look at what we might be able to learn about the first cause and its nature. We can deduce or infer what the first cause is like in this way. I see. Well, what can we learn about the first cause? Well, as I've already alluded to, the first cause must be uncaused and necessary, as opposed to caused and contingent, because if it were caused or contingent, it would need a further explanation, and we wouldn't have actually arrived at a true first cause, and we would continue to proceed toward an infinite regress. This also suggests that the first cause is supernatural, unlike natural things, which have shape and size, because as the PSR shows, things in nature have explanations for their existence and are not necessary. Okay, I think that's fair so far. If we're trying to avoid an infinite regress, we are looking for a cause that is beyond natural, caused, contingent things. Exactly, but we can go further. Given the first cause is necessary and supernatural, it is reasonable to conclude that the first cause is timeless and immaterial, boundaries that exist specifically for contingent, caused things in the universe. We can also predict that a first cause would have an enormous amount of power, at least certainly relative to us, given this first cause is capable of bringing an entire massive universe into existence, one that is simply beyond our comprehension. Sure, all of that seems like reasonable inference, but those qualities can just as easily get us to a necessary substance or event or something, like a sort of necessary timeless explosion that started the chain of causes. It really can't be proven from this that we are dealing with a personal God. Well, perhaps most importantly, we can indeed infer that the first cause is conscious. The reason is because something that is not conscious, like an event, cannot choose to act, to create, the same way a mind can. All events happen in virtue of something else. They cannot act on their own, because they don't appear to have a will. A timeless, uncreated mind, however, can freely choose to act and bring contingent things into being. In short, agent causation is a better theory of the first cause than event causation. Interesting ideas, but I'm not sure if I fully grasp the argument. Could you expand on it a bit more? Sure, it can be a challenging concept to grasp right away. Here's how we should look at this. The first necessary cause is either conscious and personal, or it is not. And in trying to determine which is a better theory, we have to consider the way that impersonal causation happens, aka event causation. This is the chain of one event leading to another event, and on, like a bowling ball that strikes a pin, and that pin then knocks down another pin. In this case, the antecedent, which is the way the ball strikes the pin, leads to or causes its effect by necessity. Things happen in a deterministic sequence and are always dependent on prior conditions caused by prior events. And this simply cannot work, because if there are prior events that determine the act of the first cause, then the first cause itself isn't really first. On the other hand, an agent, particularly one that is necessary and transcends time and space, can make the choice to create apart from a chain of prior events. That's why a conscious mind seems to better fit the profile of the first uncaused cause. Now, this is not the only argument for why the first cause is conscious. Some other arguments point to how a conscious being needs to explain the universe if it had a beginning. But I think that this argument can be fairly straightforward to understand for why the first cause is personal. What do you think? I think I see where you're going with that. A mind or consciousness is the sort of thing that could act beyond prior conditions. So we are better off positing that the first cause is a mind. It makes some sense to me. I'm not sure if I'm fully on board, but I see why you can make that deduction. That's fair, but even if it's not a 100% certain argument, the key is that it is a superior explanation for the first cause. But there's one other thing we can infer about the first cause. Because it is necessary and outside time and space, it makes more sense to see it as having certain properties, either in their fullness or not at all. What I mean by that is, if it is powerful, which we already deduced, it would make more sense to see it as all-powerful than having some finite level of power, because the latter would resemble contingent things that have these sorts of limitations being in time and space. Likewise, if the first cause is a mind, it would make more sense to see it as an omniscient mind, rather than an extremely intelligent but limited mind. By virtue of its nature, it makes little sense to place arbitrary limits on the first cause and its properties. As such, we can infer that the first cause is necessary, timeless, immaterial, all-powerful, all-knowing, changeless, and conscious. This is what we call God. Wait, but why say God when you could just as easily say gods? Why does there have to be one first cause? Well, we should prefer simpler theories that explain the data and not multiply entities beyond necessity, or Occam's razor. And so positing one first cause is a better hypothesis than multiple. The argument that I've given doesn't justify us further complicating the theory by positing additional first causes beyond one. Okay, I see. Well, that is an interesting argument. A single, conscious, immaterial, timeless, omnipotent, and necessary being, all starting from the observation that causation exists. I must say I am pretty impressed that such a strong case can be made, particularly how much sense it makes to theorize a first, uncaused cause, above other explanations. Glad to hear it. The argument certainly is not the end of the conversation. There's much more that could be said about many aspects of this argument, and I won't pretend that there couldn't be some skeptical objections out there that I might not have foolproof answers to, which is, of course, the case for pretty much all people and their beliefs. But I think the argument shows that belief in God is capable of being reasoned about, and that his existence is a strong explanation for reality, given the many shortcomings and struggles that alternatives have to deal with. There's no such thing as a perfect argument, but I think this is a good argument, and I myself find it convincing. Yeah, that's fair. I won't act like I'm instantly a theist from this, but this definitely gives me some things to think about more deeply. I can say, though, that I am definitely not going to assert theists don't have solid arguments anymore. There's a lot in this argument that I'm not sure if my worldview can do a great job dealing with. I will definitely have to check out Pruss and other philosophers now. Thank you for sharing this with me. And thank you for your openness to the argument. All I can ask is for the case to be taken seriously and not dismissed out of hand because of presuppositions. Hopefully we can discuss this further in the future. Have a blessed day.